when you start asking that question, what is money? It takes you down this extraordinary rabbit hole. And you start to realize, hang on, someone's had the ability to print their own money for a long time. Like not just a year or two. When someone's had the ability to print money for an extraordinarily long time, and not just a year or two, but like over multiple generations. So my father, as an adult, well, they printed money. And even before then, there's been different formats of that. So like multiple generations now, someone's had the ability to go and print their own money. And when you start digging into what that means, it is nefarious because it has ability to hold huge influence in every single facet of life, be that health, be that education, be that business, be that money. And with that is, just extraordinary power over narrative. And, you look at the way that the academic world can be influenced, write this paper, get paid, even if it's wrong, don't worry about it. We got your back. This morning, I was listening to your episode recently posted with Scott, and you were digging into the moon landings, and it was just a brilliant conversation to kind of tune into two guys who are willing to ask difficult questions. Scott said something about the ability for mass psychosis at scale, where everyone thinks the lunar landings are real. Like most people think that we've been to the moon, including myself until relatively recently. And it really breaks your brain. So like, what does that mean when we are lied to at that scale? That was something that Scott said that really caught my attention. It's so true. It's like, wow, like that's a massive lie. What does that mean? And I've said this many times before, which is like, you have to ask yourself when you learn about Bitcoin, why do I own what I own? Because every other asset's basically going to pale in comparison. And B, why do I know what I know? So the lunar landings are just one example of this, where I'm like, what? What do you mean you haven't been to the moon? How can that not be true? So yeah, you've come across lots of subjects like that. Like, what incentivizes someone to lie at scale like that?
This is a great question. And give me just one sec here. I'm going to look up a quote, actually. In the big lie, there is always a certain force of credibility because the broad masses of a nation are always more easily corrupted in the deeper strata of their emotional nature than consciously or voluntarily. And thus, in the primitive simplicity of their minds, they more readily fall victims to the big lie than the small lie. So they themselves often tell small lies in little matters, but would be ashamed to resort to large scale falsehoods. It would never come into their heads to fabricate colossal untruths, and they would not believe others could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously. Even though the facts which prove this to be so may be, oops, I wrote this wrong, maybe it's brought clearly to their minds, they will still doubt and waver and will continue to think there may be some other explanation. For the grossly impudent lie always leaves traces behind it, even after it has been nailed down, a fact which is known to all expert liars in this world and to all who conspire together in the art of lying. Any guesses on who wrote that?
Not a clue.
Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf, Volume 1,
Really?
Chapter 10. Yeah.
Fuck. Intense. Wow. And that brings me very nicely to a subject that you're also delving into in a way that others, and including myself, I find deeply triggering. What do you mean the Holocaust isn't real? And it it's yeah, even now I'm a bit like, what? That can't be true. And I think of a recent scenario with a friend who told me a story about their grandparents who had walked overland from Poland to Israel, got captured by the British, ended up swimming away from the prison camp they were in, and they then lived in a kibbutz in Israel and moved to the US and became Jewish migrants living in the US, and he's now third generation or second generation American or something. Real people that aren't also driving these kind of nationalistic agendas. Um, but a very difficult subject. But that's the real story of a family member of theirs. Like, how could it be that the Holocaust is not real? Um, and so when you come into these subjects, like, how does it break your brain?
And this is such a hard one. It's the most triggering one ever because we all spent so much time in our history classes in school watching Schindler's List, which was mandatory everywhere. Which it's based on a fictional book, and the history books themselves, which were written by Glencoe McGraw Hill, which is this company owned by Ghislaine Maxwell's dad, who's a Mossad agent. So all of our history books were written by Mossad, basically, and the entire mainstream media, also owned by the same group. And so this is the true definition of conspiracy when you have all these different connections that push out a certain story that they want to be heard. And when you combine that with the the people who are around during that time and part of that period, they all have a very strong incentive to keep saying what they say. And this is it's such a hard one to there's no way to introduce the Holocaust conversation other than I want people, before listening to anything that I say or anything that I've ever said about this, to go watch some movies about this. There are some really great documentaries that go through this topic very well and cover a lot of information, and I posted a lot of them on Noster. And one of them is this series you've probably seen me spamming, Europa: The Last Battle, which I think is extremely full of interesting questions. Uh, that series covers the entirety of fiat history and basically goes through a very different perspective of what actually happened during World War One, World War Two, and the Holocaust, and all of these events we were taught about in school. Is it possible that there was a completely different side to it that we were never told? And that's what I recommend people go watch for themselves. And it is extremely triggering, like you said, and it will you're not going to agree with things you see in that for sure. And I don't agree with everything in it either, but it just gives you a whole different side. It really opens your brain to the possibilities of history being very different than what we were told. And this idea that history is not black and white, cut and dry, the way that we're always told it is. When we're young kids and we're in school reading these textbooks, they look very official. We're told by a teacher who says this is the way it is, and we just assume that that's all fact. And like you were talking about, the moon landing is another example where we're told that that's what happened. This is the way it is, and it's a fact. And that's a great example of one where it doesn't take a whole lot of just looking at the details of it. And that's what I tried to do with Scott in that conversation, which I am glad to hear that you got some value out of it. A lot of people have reached out, really showing great feedback, because when you look at anything from the pictures of the lunar lander itself to I mean, I don't even know where to start. There's so many pieces of that story. To calling them on the phone, quarter million miles away, and it works better than I can call someone right now in another city. There's so many holes to the story. We lost the technology. By the way, the we lost the technology meme. The only two times we've ever lost technology for something are for moon landing technology and gas chamber technology that's able to gas 6 million people in a few years. So there's all sorts
Wow.
of these things that are pushed out there as a way to explain away these things that don't make sense. So the narratives of, oh, we lost the technology, that's just the way it was back then, we can't do it anymore. Well, why can't we do it anymore? Maybe it just never happened in the first place and we were given a really big story because everyone's heard this quote, history is written by the victors, but a lot of people just sort of hear that and they think, oh yeah, they repost it on Nostr and Twitter. They think it's a nice sounding quote, but no. What if all of your history was written by the victors, and none of it is true? And we need to start from zero and critical think our way through this from first principles, as I know Bitcoiners have the ability to do. And we are seeing that, and I'm very optimistic. More and more people are doing this and are watching the movies like Europa and these my podcast about the moon landing and these things that really throw a wrench in the entire narrative. And you don't have to agree with it. You're probably not going to agree with it, but we should be listening to these different radical ideas and come to our own conclusions about them. And it's extremely important for people to detach from the confidence that we have around these ideas of things we were taught in school, because so much of that was intentionally layered on top. And you hear this when you go into these conversations about any of these major questioning topics of things that were considered so solid and full of evidence by the mainstream narrative, is that people come at you angrily for questioning this thing. It's not just that you're an idiot for questioning this thing. In the Holocaust is a perfect example. People just say, "How dare you question this event and ask questions about this thing that happened?" Because I watched 5 million Hollywood movies that told me that this happened, and you're a terrible person for even opening that door to think about things in a different light. And it's so crazy when you realize that there's so many other, just using the Holocaust example, so many other genocides that happened in history, including the Bolshevik Revolution, just years before the Holocaust happened, where the Jews killed 50 million Christians in Russia. And we never hear about that in the history book. And there's this really great conversation on uh, what was the name, Montel Williams show, I think, where David Cole and these other historians come on there. I posted this on Nostr as well. If you just type in David Cole on my Nostr, it'll pop up. But some guy in the audience comes out during this heated discussion in the 90s about the Holocaust, when this was more allowed to question things. And he says, "Hey, I'm from Ukrainian descent. There was a genocide where Jewish people killed 7 million of my people. Where are my reparations?" And there are just so many examples of these other genocides that happen. And there's only one that you're not allowed to ask questions about. And it's the one that when you ask anyone on the street, name the worst genocide ever. What's the most tragic event that ever happened? Who's the most evil person that ever lived? They'll all tell you Hitler's the most evil person that ever lived. The most tragic thing that happened was the Holocaust, almost every time. And that's because our school system really printed that into our brain and completely forgot about all these other events that have happened. So it's all about asking questions, opening the door, questioning everything. Is like, we'll keep spamming forever. Just question the narrative and you'll get closer to the truth. And that's what I'm trying to do. People won't agree with me a lot of the time, but I think someone's got to do it.
I'm sure I saw a post somewhere that said, you know, you're deep down the rabbit hole when you start to think that Adolf Hitler was the good guy. And you're like, who thinks that? And I even had a guy recently, he said to me, "Jake, Adolf Hitler died years before the end of World War II, and everything you saw post that was actually doppelgangers. And it's just the state apparatus behind him that was doing what they wanted." So, what's real? I can't go and verify that. It was, over 50 years ago. And yes, I've watched Band of Brothers, and in whatever episode they rock up and they're like, what the fuck is this camp, or whatever TV show or movie you want to mention, Schindler's List not being obviously a classic. It's very confronting. But you're right, like if the victor can write the history books and they have a money printer, like, what are they telling us? And if you don't have a healthy attitude towards questioning what that is, then, I mean, that has to be step one, right? Of course, you can spam all day long talking about this controversial stuff. If no one's actually going to sit there and go, okay, wow, what does that mean? Then it's pointless in some senses.